The financial ghost begins with Eleanor Vance, a woman who spent 30 years as the quiet, elegant shadow behind her husband, Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Global Holdings. While Julian preened in the spotlight, Eleanor used her secret skill as a master of forensic ledgers, a talent she perfected while managing their family office, to track every cent he ever moved. Julian's mistress is Chloe Beaumont, a woman half Eleanor's age who believes she is the new queen of the Vance empire. The assets at stake are the $15 million Greenwich estate, the secret offshore Sapphire Fund, the majority shares of Vance Global Holdings, and the heritage trust meant for their children. The final coup involves Eleanor tricking Julian into signing a document he believes is a lucrative merger, but is actually a confession of tax fraud and a transfer of his personal wealth into the heritage trust, leaving him with nothing but the debt she carefully redirected into his name. The scent of expensive jasmine perfume clung to the silk scarf hidden at the bottom of Julian's mahogany desk drawer. A smell that didn't belong to me. My heart didn't race. It simply turned to ice in the stillness of our master bedroom. I didn't scream or throw the fine china. Instead, I carefully tucked the scarf back, closed the drawer with a soft click, and went downstairs to roast the lamb for his final celebratory dinner. I stood in our designer kitchen, the one Julian bought to impress the neighbors but never stepped foot in unless he wanted a glass of scotch. The lamb was sizzling in the oven, filling the house with a rich, savory aroma that masked the bitter taste in my mouth. For 30 years, I had been the perfect hostess, the perfect partner, and the silent engine behind Vance Global Holdings. Julian liked to say he built an empire with his bare hands, but I was the one who balanced the ledgers while he was at the golf course. I was the one who knew every offshore account, every tax loophole, and every dirty secret he thought he'd buried. Finding that scarf wasn't a surprise, really. It was just the final piece of evidence I needed to stop lying to myself. The girl's name was Chloe. She was 24, exactly the age of our youngest daughter. Julian thought he was being discreet, but a man who thinks he is a god rarely checks his own shadow. He had been spending more and more time at the office, but the office didn't smell like cheap jasmine and desperation. I remembered the way he looked at me this morning, with a sort of bored pity. He thought I was a relic, a piece of furniture he could replace once the upholstery got a little worn. He had no idea that while he was out buying diamonds for a girl who couldn't spell the word portfolio, I was moving his entire world into my palm. When Julian walked through the door at 7, he was humming a jaunty tune. He looked successful, tanned, and completely oblivious. He kissed my cheek and I felt a shiver of disgust, but I kept my face as smooth as the marble countertops. I served him the lamb, poured his favorite red wine, and listened to him talk about the big merger. He was so excited. He told me that once the deal went through, we would have more money than we knew what to do with. He didn't realize that the word we didn't include me in his head anymore. He was already planning his exit strategy, thinking he could toss me a few million and a condo in Florida and call it a day. He spoke about the future with such arrogance, describing the new office tower and the international expansion. I just nodded and smiled, asking him if he wanted more gravy. I smiled at him across the table. It was a practiced smile, the one I used at galas and board meetings when I had to pretend his jokes were funny. Inside, I was already moving the first pawn on the board. While he ate his dinner, I was thinking about the Sapphire Fund. He thought I didn't know about it. He thought it was his secret safety net for his new life with Chloe. But I was the one who had quietly redirected the digital keys to that fund months ago, just in case this day ever came. Julian always underestimated me because I was quiet. He forgot that the person who listens always has more information than the person who talks. He thought my silence was submission, but it was actually observation. My thoughts drifted to our children. They were grown now, with lives of their own, but they deserved the heritage we had built together, Julian was prepared to gamble their future away on a girl who liked shiny things and fast cars. That was his biggest mistake. You can mess with my heart, Julian, but you never, ever mess with my children's future. I watched him take a sip of wine, his eyes bright with greed. He looked so confident, so untouchable. It's a dangerous thing to be that confident when you are sitting across from the person who knows exactly where all the bodies are buried. I had spent decades cleaning up his messes, and now I was going to make sure he finally had to sit in one. As I cleared the plates, I mentioned the merger documents. I told him I'd seen them on his desk and that he'd be happy to help him organize the final signatures for the family office side of things. He looked relieved, almost grateful. He thought I was being the helpful, dutiful wife one last time. He even patted my hand and told me I was a good woman. I almost laughed out loud. He had no idea that the documents I would be putting in front of him tomorrow weren't the ones his lawyers had drafted. They were a much more interesting set of papers that I had been drafting in the middle of the night while he was out at clubs. The house was quiet that night, but my mind was loud with the clicking of a clock. Every second brought him closer to a reality he couldn't even imagine. He went to bed and fell asleep instantly, the heavy sleep of a man who thinks he has already won the game. I stayed up late in the study, the glow of the computer screen the only light in the room. I wasn't looking at photos of him and Chloe. I was looking at spreadsheets. Numbers don't lie, and they don't cheat. They just wait for someone smart enough to use them. By the time the sun came up, the first trap was set, and the bait was his own insatiable ego. I thought back to our early years when we were both young and hungry. We had nothing then but a small apartment and a big dream. I had worked 2 jobs to put him through business school. I had stayed up late typing his reports and editing his presentations. We were a team once. But somewhere along the line, Julian started believing his own press releases. He started thinking he was the king, and I was just the help. He forgot that a king without a kingdom is just a man in an expensive suit. And I was about to take the kingdom back, brick by brick, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. I watched the sunrise from the balcony, holding a cold cup of coffee. The Greenwich estate looked so peaceful in the morning light. It was a beautiful prison. But the gates were about to swing open for me and lock tight behind him. I felt a strange sense of peace. The grief had burned out weeks ago, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I knew exactly what had to be done. Julian would go to the office today thinking he was about to become a billionaire. I would go to the office today to make sure he became a memory. Subscribe and comment where you are watching from. Because I didn't cry. I made a plan. I remember the exact moment the floor fell away from beneath my feet. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays in Greenwich are usually quiet, filled with the sound of the gardener's shears and the distant hum of the neighbor's pool filters. I was in Julian's private study, a room filled with heavy oak furniture and the smell of expensive cigars. I was not snooping. I was doing what I had done for 3 decades. I was being helpful. Julian had left his briefcase open, and a stack of papers had spilled onto the Persian rug. As I bent down to gather them, a small, glossy slip of paper fluttered out from a hidden pocket in the leather lining. It was a receipt from a boutique on 5th Avenue. 5 figures for a single diamond necklace. I felt a small prickle of excitement at first, thinking it was a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But then I saw the date. It had been purchased 3 months ago. Our anniversary was not for another half year. And then I saw the delivery address. It was not our home. It was a luxury apartment complex in the city, addressed to a woman named Chloe. The name Chloe sounded like a bell ringing in a dark room. I knew that name. She was the new marketing assistant at Vance Global, a girl with bright eyes and a smile that seemed a little too wide whenever Julian walked into the room. I sat down in his large leather chair, the one that always made me feel small. My hands were not shaking. That was the strangest part. I felt a sudden, sharp coldness wash over me, starting at my fingertips and moving toward my heart. I did not reach for a tissue. I reached for the spare laptop he kept in the desk drawer. I knew his passwords. He used the same one for everything. The date of his first big $1 million deal. He thought he was being clever, but he was just predictable. I spent the next 4 hours in that chair. The sun moved across the room, casting long shadows over the mahogany desk, but I did not move. I navigated through the digital layers of our life like a ghost. I have always had a gift for numbers. While Julian was the face of the company, the one who gave the speeches and shook the hands, I was the one who understood the architecture of our wealth. I saw the patterns. I saw the small monthly transfers to a shell company I had never heard of. I saw the payments for a silver sports car. And then I found the Sapphire Fund. It was a secret account, hidden behind 3 layers of international banks. He had been funneling money out of our family office for over a year. He was building a nest for himself and this girl, using the straw from my own nest to do it. For a moment, just one heartbeat, I felt the grief. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. I thought about the 30 years of dinners I had cooked, the 3 children I had raised, the nights I stayed up late editing his business proposals. I thought about the time I sold my engagement ring in the early days just so we could make payroll. All of that history felt like a lie. But as quickly as the grief arrived, it left. It was replaced by something much more useful. It was a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that Julian did not just want a new life. He wanted to steal the one we had built and leave me with the wreckage. He thought I was a soft, aging woman who would not notice the missing pieces of her own life. He thought I was a relic. I closed the laptop and put the papers back exactly as I had found them. I even made sure the receipt was tucked back into the hidden pocket of his briefcase. I walked out of the study and went into the kitchen. I moved with a strange, liquid grace. I started preparing dinner. I chose a recipe that required a lot of chopping. Onions, garlic, herbs. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the wooden board was soothing. I was not Eleanor, the grieving wife. I was Eleanor, the master of the ledger. I began to run through the numbers in my head, calculating the percentages, the tax implications, and the legal loopholes. I knew our finances better than Julian ever would. He saw the big picture, the grand gestures. I saw the fine print, and it is always the fine print that brings a man down. Julian came home at 6. He looked tired but happy, the way a man looks when he thinks he is getting away with something. He dropped his keys on the counter and came over to kiss my cheek. I did not flinch. I let him press his lips against my skin, even though it felt like a brand. He smelled like wood smoke and that faint, lingering scent of jasmine perfume that I now knew belonged to Chloe. He told me about his day, about a meeting that had gone long, about the stress of the upcoming merger. He lied with such ease that I almost admired it. He sat down at the table and poured himself a glass of wine, complaining about the traffic on the Merritt Parkway. I served him the meal. It was a beautiful roast, perfectly seasoned. I sat across from him and watched him eat. He looked so comfortable, so sure of his place in the world. He started talking about the future, about how we should take a trip to Europe once the deal was closed. He was dangling a carrot in front of me, a reward for my years of service, even as he was preparing to fire me from his life. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I did not see the man I had loved for 30 years. I saw a liability. I saw a series of mistakes waiting to be corrected. He looked up from his plate and caught me staring. He asked me if something was wrong. I let a slow, gentle smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile you give a child who thinks they have hidden a secret that you have already found. I told him that nothing was wrong at all. I told him that I was just thinking about how much I appreciated everything we had built together. He smiled back, his ego fed and his suspicions non-existent. He had no idea that while he was chewing his dinner, I was already dismantling his world. I reached across the table and patted his hand, feeling the cold metal of his wedding ring. It was the first move of the game, and he did not even know the board had been set. The next morning, I did not wake up as the woman who had been betrayed. I woke up as the woman who was going to win. I lay in our king-sized bed, watching the dust motes dancing in a beam of sunlight that hit the heavy velvet curtains. And for the first time in 30 years, the house felt like a set of coordinates rather than a home. Julian was already gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of his cologne and a rumpled pillow. Usually, I would have smoothed the sheets and felt a pang of loneliness, wondering if he would be home for dinner. Not today. Today, the silence was my greatest ally. I got out of bed and put on my silk robe, the one Julian bought me for my 50th birthday. At the time, I thought it was a gesture of love. Now, I saw it for what it was. A uniform for the role he expected me to play. The elegant, quiet wife who stayed in her lane. I walked down the grand staircase, my bare feet silent on the cold marble. I didn't go to the kitchen for coffee. I went straight to the sunroom at the back of the house. This was my sanctuary, filled with my orchids and the books Julian never bothered to open. I sat at my small writing desk and opened a fresh, leather-bound notebook. It was a gift from our daughter, Sarah, intended for garden notes or recipes. On the very first page, I wrote a single word in my neatest handwriting. Inventory. I began to list everything, not just the big things like the Greenwich estate or the vacation home in Aspen, but the things Julian thought I was too flighty to track. I listed the vintage car collection, the private jet shares, and the art pieces we had acquired over 3 decades. I wrote down the dates of purchase and the approximate current values. My mind felt like a high-powered calculator, clicking through years of data that I had stored away simply because I had nothing else to do while Julian was out being the great man. I realized then that I wasn't just his wife. I was the most overqualified archivist in the state of Connecticut. While I was writing, the phone on the desk buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Running late, big meeting with the board, don't wait up for dinner. I stared at the screen for a long moment. A year ago, I would have replied with a frowny face and a reminder to eat something healthy. Today, I typed back, "Of course, dear. Good luck with the merger. You deserve everything that is coming to you." I put the phone down and felt a strange, cold thrill. He would read that as a supportive wife's encouragement. He had no idea it was a prophecy. By noon, I had moved from my notebook to my computer. I needed to see the numbers Julian thought he had scrubbed. I called a woman named Mrs. Higgins. She had been the office manager for Vance Global for 25 years before Julian forced her into an early retirement because he wanted someone younger and more malleable. I knew Mrs. Higgins loved me, and more importantly, I knew she hated the way Julian had discarded her. We talked for over an hour. She told me things about the Sapphire Fund that even I hadn't guessed. She told me about the shell companies Julian had set up in the Cayman Islands, and she told me exactly which digital trail led to the money he was using to pay for Chloe's lifestyle. She still had her old login credentials for the secondary server. She gave them to me without hesitation. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of clinical focus. I wasn't Eleanor the wife anymore. I was a forensic accountant with a personal grudge. I saw how Julian had been slowly siphoning off the Heritage Trust, the money we had set aside for our children's futures. That was the moment my heart truly hardened. He could cheat on me, he could lie to me, and he could replace me with a girl half my age. But he would not steal from our children. He was using Sarah's inheritance to buy diamond necklaces for a girl who couldn't even spell the word portfolio. The anger was there, bubbling under the surface, but I pushed it down. Anger is loud and messy. I needed to be quiet and precise. I realized I couldn't do this entirely alone. I needed a professional, but not the kind of lawyer Julian would expect. He would expect me to hire a high-profile divorce attorney who would make a lot of noise and file for a temporary restraining order. That would give him time to hide the assets even deeper. No, I needed a surgeon. I needed someone who understood the dark corners of the financial world. I remembered a man named Arthur Vance. No relation to us, just a coincidence of name. He had been the lead counsel for Julian's biggest rival a decade ago. Julian had called him a shark and a cheat because Arthur was the only man who had ever truly beaten him in a negotiation. Arthur was semi-retired now, living in a quiet town a few hours away. I didn't call him from the house phone. I went to a local park, sat on a bench near a playground where no one knew me, and used a burner phone I had bought at a convenience store earlier that morning. When Arthur answered, his voice was like gravel. He didn't recognize my name at first, but when I told him I was Julian Vance's wife and that I had the keys to the Sapphire Fund, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then he spoke one word. Interesting. We agreed to meet the following day at a nondescript diner halfway between our homes. I didn't tell him I wanted a divorce. I told him I wanted an audit. I told him I wanted to protect the Heritage Trust and that I wanted to ensure Julian Vance ended up with exactly what he had when I first met him in that drafty apartment 30 years ago. Nothing but his ego and a suit he couldn't afford. Arthur chuckled, a dry, papery sound. He told me to bring everything I had. That night, when Julian finally came home, I was waiting for him in the living room. I was wearing a soft cashmere sweater and holding a glass of sherry. The house was dimly lit, and I looked every bit the picture of the devoted, aging spouse. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes slightly glazed. He told me the meeting had been grueling. He told me he was so lucky to have a home to come back to, where things were simple and peaceful. I smiled at him, a gentle maternal smile that hid the predator underneath. I told him I had spent the day organizing the family archives and that I had found some old papers that needed his signature for the family office records. He barely looked at me as he headed for the stairs, saying he would handle it in the morning. He had no idea that the papers I was preparing were the first strings of a web that was about to tighten around his throat. I watched him walk away, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like his shadow. I felt like his ghost. I went back to my study and picked up the phone to confirm the meeting with Arthur. The first move was made. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. I waited until the house was breathing. That is the only way to describe the sound of a large, empty home at night. Julian was a heavy sleeper, especially after 2 glasses of expensive scotch. I would lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, counting his breaths until they turned into that low, rhythmic rumble. Only then would I slide out from under the heavy down comforter. I did not turn on the lights. I knew every inch of this house. I had picked out the molding, the wallpaper, and the rugs myself over 30 years. I could navigate the long hallway to his study in total darkness without making a single sound. My destination was always the same, the small office tucked behind the library. Julian called it his trophy room. It was filled with framed photos of him shaking hands with famous people and holding oversized scissors at ribbon cuttings. But to me, it was just a room full of filing cabinets and a very expensive computer he barely knew how to use. He thought a password was enough to keep me out. He forgot that I was the one who set up his first email account when we were younger. I knew his patterns better than he knew his own face. He always used the same numbers, the same logic. He was a man of habit, and his habits were about to become his downfall. I sat in his large leather chair, the coldness of the material seeping through my silk robe. I used the login information that my old friend Mrs. Higgins had whispered to me over the phone. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird the first time I saw the screen flicker to life. I was not looking for love letters or photos of his mistress. I was looking for the math of a betrayal. I started with the company's internal ledger, the one the public and the regular employees never saw. I looked for the leaks in the bucket. It did not take long to find them. Julian was not a criminal mastermind. He was just an arrogant man who thought no one was smart enough to look at his work. I found a line in the accounts labeled miscellaneous consulting. It was a steady stream of money, $50,000 every single month, flowing out of the main account and into a company called Azure Ventures. I used a search tool to find the address for Azure Ventures. It was a simple P.O. box in the Grand Cayman Islands. My fingers flew over the keys. I felt a strange sort of high, a cold adrenaline I had never felt before. This was what I was built for. I had spent 30 years being the quiet wife at the end of the table, the one who just smiled and nodded, but my brain had never stopped working. I moved to the Heritage Trust next. This was the most painful part of the night. This was the sacred ground. This was the money my own father had left for my children, and the money Julian and I had promised to never touch until our kids were much older. When I saw the current balance, I had to cover my mouth with my hand to keep from crying out in the silence of the room. He had taken nearly $4 million out over the last 18 months. He was draining our children's future to fund a fantasy life. I saw charges for a penthouse rental in the city. I saw a wire transfer for a luxury yacht charter in the Mediterranean. Every cent he spent on Chloe was a cent he stole from our daughter's tuition and our son's first home. The betrayal was no longer just about me. It was about our blood. The most difficult part of my nightly mission was the physical evidence. Julian kept a small, old-fashioned leather ledger in his briefcase. He was old school in that way. He liked to see his net worth written in his own hand. Every few nights, he would leave the briefcase in the mudroom by the back door. I would creep down the stairs at 2 in the morning, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. I would open the brass latches with agonizing slowness, wincing at every tiny click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I would hold my breath, listening for any stir from the floor above. Then, I would photograph every single page. The flash was off, the room lit only by the tiny green light on the microwave in the kitchen. I saw his notes in the margins of the pages. Sell the Greenwich house by spring. One note said in his messy scrawl. Another one was even worse. Tell Eleanor after the merger. He was planning to wait until his big business deal was finished, take the largest share of the money for himself, and leave me with the scraps of a life he no longer wanted. He had even calculated my settlement on a piece of scratch paper. It was a pittance, a tiny fraction of what I was legally owed after 3 decades of marriage. He had written a question mark next to my name. It was as if I were just an unsolved problem he was tired of thinking about. I spent weeks in this twilight world. By day, I was the woman who reminded him to take his vitamins and organized his dry cleaning for his big meetings. By night, I was a ghost in the machine, a shadow moving through his digital life. I began to build my own master file on a secret laptop I kept hidden under the floorboards of my potting shed in the garden. I mapped out every account, every offshore shell company, and every hidden asset he thought was buried deep. I found a secret stash of gold coins in a safety deposit box he thought I did not know about. I found the deeds to 2 properties in the mountains held under a fake company name. I worked until my eyes burned, and the sky began to turn a bruised purple with the coming dawn. I would crawl back into bed just as the first birds started to chirp outside our window, my body exhausted but my mind on fire with purpose. I would press my back against Julian's, feeling the warmth of his skin, and I would think about how little he actually knew. He thought he was the hunter in this story. But I was the one marking his trail and counting his steps. By the end of the 3rd week, the picture was finally complete. I sat in my sunroom, the morning light pouring in over my orchids, and looked at the final numbers on my screen. I knew exactly how much Julian Vance was worth, down to the very last penny. I knew where every dollar was hidden, and which string I needed to pull to make the whole structure unravel. I was no longer just his wife. I was his judge and his silent executioner. I had the map to his entire empire in my hands. I looked at the list one last time. It was a staggering amount of money, a fortune built on my silence and his greed. He thought he was preparing for a clean break from our marriage, but he had left a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to his own destruction. I closed my secret file and felt a cold, hard satisfaction. The audit was over. I had everything I needed to bankrupt him without ever breaking a single law. Now, it was time to take this map to the one man who could help me set the fire. I dressed in my best suit, checked my reflection to make sure my mask was perfectly in place, and prepared to leave the house. My husband thought he was going to a business lunch, but I was going to a war room. The night of our 30th anniversary gala was supposed to be the crowning jewel of our life in Greenwich. The ballroom at the country club was filled with the scent of 1,000 white lilies and the expensive perfumes of 300 guests. I had spent months planning every detail, from the hand-painted invitations to the vintage champagne that cost more per bottle than my first car. I wore a gown of deep emerald silk that flowed around my ankles like water. I looked in the mirror that evening and saw a woman who was composed, elegant, and entirely dangerous. Julian had no idea that the woman standing before him was not his loyal wife of 3 decades, but a strategist who had already mapped out the end of his empire. When we arrived at the club, Julian was beaming. He loved being the center of attention, the successful CEO with the beautiful home and the perfect life. He spent the first hour shaking hands and slapping backs, laughing loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I stood by his side, the perfect hostess, greeting our friends and neighbors with a warmth that felt as natural as breathing. I could feel the eyes of the other women on me. They knew. In a town like this, secrets have a way of leaking through the floorboards. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, wondering when the cracks would finally show. I just smiled and offered them more appetizers. The shift in the room happened at exactly 8 o'clock. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and a young woman walked in. She was wearing a dress of shimmering silver that was far too short for an anniversary gala, and around her neck was the diamond necklace I had seen the receipt for in Julian's desk. It was Chloe. The room went silent for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight. People stopped talking mid-sentence. The only sound was the clinking of a silver spoon against a glass. Julian didn't look shocked. He looked proud. He walked away from me, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the dance floor, and went straight to her. He took her hand and led her toward the head table, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand, but I did not let a single muscle in my face move. I saw our daughter, Sarah, stand up from her seat, her face flushed with anger. I saw our son, Michael, ball his fists. I moved quickly, intercepting them before they could make a scene. I placed a hand on Sarah's arm and looked her in the eye. "Not tonight," I whispered, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "We are Vances. We do not crumble in public." I led them back to their seats, my head held high, and then I did the one thing no one expected. I walked right up to Julian and Chloe. I didn't scream, I didn't throw my drink. I looked at Chloe and gave her a soft, motherly smile. "You must be Chloe," I said, my voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Julian told me the office was sending over some extra help for the event tonight. How kind of you to come in such festive attire." I turned to Julian and patted his cheek. "You always were so thoughtful about the staff, dear. But perhaps she should find a seat near the back with the other assistants. We wouldn't want her to feel out of place at the family table." The look on Chloe's face was worth every second of the pain I had felt over the last few weeks. She turned a bright, angry red, her mouth dropping open in shock. She had expected a weeping wife or a screaming match. She had expected to be the new queen of the room. Instead, I had treated her like a hired hand. Julian looked stunned. his mouth working but no words coming out. He had underestimated my grace, thinking it was a sign of weakness. He didn't realize that grace is a weapon when used correctly. I turned away from them and continued my rounds, chatting about the weather and the upcoming charity auction, as if nothing had happened. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in performance. I sat through the dinner, eating small bites of the salmon and nodding politely, while Julian tried to ignore the tension at the table. Chloe sat 2 seats down, looking miserable and out of place among the older, more established couples. Every time someone looked at her, I would say something kind about her work ethic or how hard it must be to find a dress on a marketing assistant's salary. I was killing her with 1,000 tiny, polite cuts. By the time the main course was cleared, Julian was sweating, and Chloe was staring at her lap, her confidence completely shattered. As the band started to play a slow song, Julian stood up to give his toast. He grabbed the microphone, his hand shaking slightly. He talked about his 30 years of success. He talked about the future of Vance Global. He mentioned me briefly, calling me the rock of the family, but his eyes kept flickering toward Chloe. It was a pathetic display of a man trying to have his cake and eat it too. The guests clapped politely, but the air in the room was thick with judgment. They saw a man who had brought a child to his own anniversary party, and they saw a wife who was handling it with a dignity he didn't deserve. I waited until the applause died down and the dancing began. I leaned over to Julian and whispered that I needed to check on the catering staff in the kitchen. He nodded, relieved to have me away from the table for a few minutes, so he could attend to his sulking mistress. I walked out of the ballroom, my emerald silk rustling against the marble floor. I didn't go to the kitchen. I walked through the long, quiet hallway of the country club, past the trophies and the old photographs, until I reached the privacy of the ladies' lounge. I went into the furthest stall and locked the door. I took a deep breath, letting the mask slip for just a moment. My hands were finally shaking, and my eyes burned with unshed tears. But I wouldn't let them fall. Not yet. I pulled the burner phone from the hidden pocket of my gown. I dialed the number I had memorized days ago. When the voice on the other end answered, I didn't hesitate. "Arthur," I said, my voice cold and precise. He brought her. He brought her to the gala. The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Arthur replied that he was sorry. I told him not to be. I told him that Julian had just provided the final piece of the puzzle. He had humiliated me in front of everyone we knew, and in doing so, he had proven exactly the kind of man he was. He had made it easy for a jury to believe the worst of him. I told Arthur to move the funds. Every penny that I had mapped out from the Sapphire Fund and the hidden offshore accounts was to be shifted into the Heritage Trust immediately. I told him to file the papers we had prepared, the ones that would trigger an automatic audit of Julian's personal spending over the last 5 years. I wanted the fire to start tonight, while he was still dancing in the ballroom with a girl who didn't even know his middle name. I hung up the phone and looked at myself in the mirror. I straightened my hair, reapplied my lipstick, and smoothed the silk of my dress. I looked like a woman who had just had a pleasant conversation about the weather. I walked back toward the ballroom, the sound of the music getting louder with every step. I could see Julian through the glass doors, leaning in to whisper something to Chloe, his face full of a foolish, blind confidence. He thought he had survived the night. He thought he had won. He had no idea that I had just signed the warrant for his professional and financial execution. I pushed open the doors and stepped back into the light, ready to finish the dance. The morning after the gala, the house was draped in a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The smell of the lilies I had ordered for the party had turned from sweet to cloying, like the scent of a funeral parlor. I sat in the breakfast nook, watching the steam rise from my tea while Julian sat across from me. He was nursing a headache and hiding behind the financial section of the newspaper. He hadn't apologized for bringing Chloe to our anniversary party. In his mind, he had won. He had shown the world that he was the one in charge, and he expected me to simply fade into the background like a piece of old furniture. He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Eleanor," he said, his voice scratchy. "We need to talk about the merger. I need you to sign off on the family office transfers today. The banks are being prickly about the liquidity for the new tower." I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I just took a slow sip of my tea. "Of course, Julian," I said softly. "I have the papers ready in the study. I went ahead and updated the schedules for the family holdings so everything is current. It will save your lawyers a lot of time." He gave me a short, dismissive nod, already turning back to his paper. "Good. Glad you are being sensible. We will get through this transition, and everyone will be taken care of." He thought he was talking about a divorce settlement. He thought he was being generous. He had no idea that I had spent the previous night with Arthur, the shark lawyer who had once been his greatest enemy. Arthur had spent hours going over the fine print of our family office structure. Because I had been the one to file the original incorporation papers 30 years ago, I held a title Julian had long forgotten, the managing member of the Vance Heritage Trust. In his arrogance, he had never bothered to check if his power of attorney over the company overrode my foundational rights to the family assets. It didn't. I led him into the study. The room felt cold, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. On the desk sat a thick stack of documents. To a man as hurried and self-important as Julian, they looked like the standard merger agreements he had been signing for weeks. He didn't see that the top page was a simple authorization form for the transfer of the title of our Greenwich estate. He didn't see that the second page was a reclassification of his majority shares in Vance Global Holdings. "Julian," I said, handing him my favorite fountain pen, "I need you to sign here, here, and on the final page of the addendum. This confirms that the assets are being moved into the Heritage Trust for the purpose of the merger." He didn't even read them. He was so eager to get to his meeting with Chloe, so desperate to finalize his new life, that he just scribbled his name across the lines I pointed out. I watched the ink dry on the paper. It was a strange feeling, watching 30 years of marriage be dismantled by a man who was too busy looking at his watch to notice he was signing away his life. Each signature was a nail in the coffin of his empire. With those signatures, the $15 million estate we were standing in was no longer his. It was now legally owned by the Heritage Trust, an irrevocable entity set up for our children, with me as the sole trustee. He could live here as long as I allowed it, but he could never sell it, borrow against it, or use it as collateral for his mistress's lifestyle. Even more importantly, his voting shares in Vance Global, the very source of his power, were now held in that same trust. He had just turned himself into an employee of his own children. I took the papers back and tucked them into a folder. "Thank you, Julian," I said. "I will have these couriered to the records office immediately." He stood up, looking relieved. "You're a good woman, Eleanor. I know things have been tense, but you've always been a team player. I appreciate you making this easy." He actually reached out and patted my shoulder, a gesture of patronizing affection that made my skin crawl. He then walked out of the room, shouting for the driver to bring the car around. He was heading to the city, probably to buy Chloe an expensive lunch to celebrate his big win. I stood by the window and watched the black town car pull down the long gravel driveway. I waited until the gates clicked shut behind him. Then I picked up the phone and called Arthur. "It's done," I said. He signed everything. The house, the shares, and the secondary accounts are all inside the trust now. "Good," Arthur replied, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "Now comes the part he won't see coming. Since the trust is irrevocable and you are the trustee, his access to those funds is officially cut off as of the moment the records office stamps these papers. I have a notary waiting at the courthouse. Bring them now." I drove myself to the courthouse. I didn't use the driver. I wanted to feel the steering wheel in my hands. I wanted to be the one to hand over the documents. As I walked into the government building, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in decades. I was no longer the silent wife. I was the architect of a new reality. The clerk at the window was a woman about my age with tired eyes and a kind smile. She took the thick stack of papers and started the process of stamping each page. The sound of the heavy rubber stamp hitting the paper was rhythmic and final. Thump. The house was gone. Thump. The shares were moved. Thump. The Sapphire Fund was locked away. Once the last page was stamped, the clerk handed me a receipt. "All set, Mrs. Vance," she said. "These are now part of the public record. The transfer is irrevocable." I thanked her and walked back out into the crisp afternoon air. I looked at my watch. It was 2:00. In exactly 3 hours, the automated system at the bank would trigger a notification to Julian. He would find that his personal black card, the one he used to pay for Chloe's penthouse and her jewelry, would be declined. He would find that his access to the Vance Global corporate accounts had been restricted to a modest salary, approved by the trustee. I drove back to the house, but I didn't go inside. I went to the garden. I sat on the stone bench overlooking the rose bushes I had planted when Sarah was born. The house behind me was a masterpiece of architecture, a symbol of everything Julian thought he owned. But the name on the deed had changed. The power had shifted. I sat there in the silence, listening to the wind in the trees. I felt a sense of peace that was almost chilling. I hadn't broken any laws. I hadn't stolen a cent. I had simply moved the pieces of our life into a vault that he no longer had the key to. He would come home tonight expecting a celebratory drink and a quiet wife. Instead, he was going to find that the very ground he walked on had been sold out from under him, and the clock on his old life had just run out of time. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to our children. I told them I loved them and that their future was finally safe. Then, I turned the phone off. I wanted to enjoy the last few hours of his ignorance. I wanted to be sitting right here, in this chair, when he finally realized that his silent wife had just become his landlord. The trap was set, the door was locked, and I was the only one with the key. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to go down, and for Julian to realize he was a guest in a house he no longer owned. The city was humming with a restless energy that night, but I felt as still as a frozen lake. I had chosen my outfit with the same care a general uses to pick a battlefield. It was a navy blue silk suit, tailored to perfection, with a single strand of my mother's pearls around my neck. I looked exactly like the woman Julian had married 30 years ago, the woman he thought he knew inside and out. I looked like a person who was content to stay in the shadows, a person who would never dream of making a scene. That was my greatest advantage. He expected me to be at home, perhaps crying into a glass of wine or reorganizing the linen closet to distract myself from his betrayal. He never expected me to show up at the steakhouse where he held his most important power dinners. The steakhouse was a place of dark wood, heavy leather chairs, and the thick scent of expensive cigars. It was a place where men like Julian went to feel like kings. As I stepped through the heavy brass doors, the maître d' recognized me immediately. He started to lead me toward Julian's usual table in the back corner, the one tucked away for privacy, but I stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. I told him I knew the way, and that I wanted to surprise my husband. The man smiled, thinking I was a doting wife bringing a forgotten gift. He had no idea I was bringing a wrecking ball. I could hear Julian's voice before I saw him. It was a loud, booming sound, full of the unearned confidence of a man who thinks the world is his playground. He was sitting with 3 of his biggest investors, men who controlled billions of dollars. They were all leaning in, hanging on his every word as he described the details of the upcoming merger. He looked flush with success, his face red from the wine and the heat of his own ego. Chloe was not there, of course. This was a night for the big boys, a night for serious business. He thought he was at the very peak of his life. He thought he was untouchable, I walked toward the table with a slow, steady pace. I didn't rush. I wanted to savor the moment. I watched as one of the investors looked up and saw me, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion. Then Julian noticed the change in the air. He turned around, his smile faltering for just a second when he saw me standing there, but he recovered quickly. He was a master of the public mask after all. He stood up, smoothing his expensive suit jacket, and put on that fake, charming grin he used for shareholders. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing warmth. "What a lovely surprise. Gentlemen, you all remember my wife, the lovely Eleanor." He reached out to take my hand, probably intending to lead me away before I could say anything that might ruin the mood. But I didn't take his hand. I stood my ground, my purse clutched firmly at my side. I looked at the men around the table and gave them a polite, practiced nod. "I am so sorry to interrupt your dinner," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I just realized that Julian left some very important documents at home this morning, and I knew he would need them before the night was over." Julian laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Always looking out for me, aren't you, dear? Just give them to me, and I will look at them later. We are right in the middle of discussing the New York Tower expansion." He reached for the heavy white envelope I was holding, his eyes already drifting back to his friends. He thought I was bringing him the merger papers he had signed earlier. He thought I was his errand girl, helping him secure his fortune. I handed him the envelope, but I didn't let go right away. I looked him straight in the eyes, and for a brief moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. "I want you to read the first page, Julian," I said softly. "It is very important for the transition we discussed." He frowned, a little annoyed by my persistence, but he didn't want to look rude in front of his investors. He pulled a silver letter opener from his pocket, a gift I had given him 10 years ago, and sliced the envelope open. I watched his face as he pulled out the papers. At first, there was nothing but a bored curiosity. He scanned the top of the page, his eyes moving quickly. Then, I saw the exact second the reality hit him. His brow furrowed. The color started to drain from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and old under the harsh light of the chandelier. He saw the words "petition for dissolution of marriage" at the top. He saw my signature, bold and final. But more importantly, he saw the attached notice from the Heritage Trust. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly open. "Eleanor, what is this? This is some kind of joke, right?" He tried to keep his voice low, but I could hear the sharp edge of panic starting to bleed through. The investors were watching us now. Their interest peaked. They could smell the change in the room. They knew something had gone wrong, even if they didn't know what it was yet. "It is no joke, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "You signed the transfer papers this morning. The house, the majority shares, and all the connected accounts are now held by the trust. And as the sole trustee, I have decided that your services are no longer required. I have also filed for divorce. You will find that your personal credit cards have been deactivated, and your access to the company accounts has been restricted to your base salary. I have already had the locks changed at the Greenwich estate. Your things will be delivered to your office tomorrow morning." He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He couldn't process it. In his mind, he was the king, and I was just a queen consort who did what she was told. He thought he had tricked me into signing away my rights, but he was the one who hadn't read the fine print. He had been so blinded by his greed and his desire for a younger woman that he had handed me the keys to his own prison. He looked down at the papers again, his hands starting to shake just a little. The silence at the table was deafening. One of the investors cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Julian realized he was losing face, and that was the one thing he couldn't stand. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He looked at the papers, and then he looked at me, and suddenly he started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a loud, mocking sound that echoed off the dark wood walls of the restaurant. He leaned back in his chair, tossing the papers onto the table as if they were nothing more than a scrap of junk mail. "You really think you can do this, Eleanor?" he said, his voice returning to its usual arrogant boom. "You think a few pieces of paper can take away everything I built? You're a housewife. You've spent 30 years picking out curtains and hosting tea parties. My lawyers will have this thrown out by Monday morning. You have no idea how the real world works. You've made a very big mistake, and you are going to regret this for the rest of your life." He looked around at his friends, inviting them to join in on the joke. He thought he was still the smartest man in the room. He thought his money and his power were still there, just behind a temporary curtain. He didn't realize that the curtain had been burned to the ground. He didn't realize that while he was laughing, the trust was already moving the last of the liquid assets into a secure account he could never touch. He didn't know that the men sitting at the table with him were already calculating how to distance themselves from a man who had just lost his majority shares. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to explain. I just gave him one last pitying look. "I hope you enjoyed the steak, Julian," I said quietly, "because it is the last thing you will ever buy on my dime." I turned around and walked away, my head held high. As I reached the door, I could still hear him laughing behind me, a loud, hollow sound that filled the room. He thought he had won the round. He had no idea that the game was already over, and he was the only one who hadn't noticed the scoreboard. I stepped out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of 30 years finally lift off my shoulders. The next move was already in motion, and Julian was still laughing his way toward a cliff he couldn't see. I arrived at the Vance Global headquarters at exactly 9 o'clock. The sun was reflecting off the glass tower, making it look like a pillar of gold. But I knew the rot that was hidden inside the walls. I did not take the back entrance like a woman hiding from a storm. I walked right through the front lobby, past the marble fountains and the giant bronze statue of Julian's grandfather. The young woman at the front desk looked up from her computer, her eyes wide with surprise. She knew who I was, of course. I had been coming to this building for 30 years, often bringing Julian a change of clothes for a late flight or a home-cooked dinner when he was working through the night on a big deal. She started to say something, but I just gave her a polite, practiced nod and kept walking toward the private elevators. My heels made a rhythmic, clicking sound on the polished stone floor, sounding like a clock counting down the final seconds of a long era. The ride up to the top floor felt like it took an eternity. I watched the numbers on the digital screen climb higher and higher, my reflection in the polished brass panels looking back at me. I looked calm, almost serene. I looked like a woman going to a pleasant lunch date with an old friend. My heart was thumping against my ribs, but it was not out of fear or hesitation. It was the steady, heavy rhythm of a hunter who finally has the target in her sights after a long and patient chase. When the doors finally opened, the executive floor was eerily quiet. Most of the administrative staff were already in the grand conference room for the weekly board meeting. I could see the light glowing through the frosted glass doors at the end of the long hallway. I pushed open the double oak doors without knocking. The sound of the heavy wood hitting the stoppers echoed through the room like a clap of thunder in a small valley. Every single head at the long table turned toward me at once. There were 12 of them sitting there, men and women I had known for decades. I had sat at dinner tables with their families, attended their children's weddings, and shared holiday cards every December for half my life. They were the guardians of the Vance legacy, and at that very moment, they were listening to Julian explain why the upcoming merger was a sure thing for their portfolios. Julian was standing at the head of the table, a laser pointer in one hand and a glass of sparkling water in the other. He looked every bit the powerful CEO, his suit perfectly pressed and his hair silvered at the temples just enough to look distinguished. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he dropped the pointer. It clattered against the mahogany surface, the tiny red light dancing wildly across the ceiling like a panicked firefly. "Eleanor?" he stammered, his voice losing all its usual authority and dropping into a shaky register. "What on earth are you doing here? We are in the middle of a private executive session. You need to leave immediately. We can talk about whatever this is at home." I did not leave. I walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one usually reserved for the company's legal counsel. I placed my leather briefcase on the table with a soft final thud that seemed to vibrate through the wood. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the room. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have some information that is vital to the future of this company and your personal investments. Information that Julian seems to have accidentally left out of his morning presentation." Julian's face went from a pale white to a deep, angry purple in a matter of seconds. He looked around at the board members, his eyes searching for an ally, someone to help him usher me out of the room. "She is not well," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "She is going through some very difficult personal issues and is clearly confused. Guards, someone call security and have her escorted out." But to his visible shock, no one moved. The board members were not looking at Julian anymore. They were looking at me, and then they were looking at the thick, blue folders I was pulling out of my bag and laying on the table. They could see the Vance Global logo on the top of the documents, and they could see the red stamps of the bank seals. I started to slide the folders down the long mahogany table, making sure they glided across the polished surface until they reached the hands of the people sitting there. I made sure each board member got a copy of what I had found. I did not use big, complicated words. I did not talk about fiduciary duties or embezzlement. I spoke about the simple, ugly truth. "I want you all to look at the chart on page 4, I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning. "You will see a long list of payments made over the last 18 months to a company called Azure Ventures." Julian told the accounting department that this was a consulting firm helping with the merger. But if you look at the rental receipts on page 5, you will see a different story. I paused, letting them turn the pages. The sound of the paper rustling was the only noise in the room. "You will see that Azure Ventures is actually the primary leaseholder for a penthouse on Park Avenue," I continued. "A penthouse occupied by a 24-year-old marketing assistant named Chloe Beaumont. You will also see charges for a diamond necklace from Fifth Avenue, a silver sports car, and a 3-week yacht charter in the Mediterranean that was billed as a business research trip. Julian has been using the company's capital to build a private playground for his mistress, and he has been doing it while the pension fund for your employees is underperforming." The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning system in the ceiling. Mr. Henderson, the oldest member of the board and a man who had been a mentor to Julian since he was a young man, put on his reading glasses with trembling hands. He leaned in close to the paper, his face hardening into a mask of disgust as he flipped through the bank statements and the photos of the receipts. He saw the money that should have been in the company's expansion fund being used to buy a life for a girl who had only been with the company for 6 months. I looked at Julian. He was leaning against the table now, his hands gripping the edge of the wood so hard his knuckles were white and skeletal. He looked small and old. For the first time in 30 years, the great and powerful Julian Vance looked like a frightened little boy who'd been caught doing something terrible and had no way to hide. "Eleanor, please, don't do this here," he whispered, but his voice had no power left. It was a plea, not a command. The board members were starting to murmur to one another, their heads bowed together in urgent conversation. I heard the word scandal. I heard the word liability. I heard the word termination. Mrs. Gable, the most formidable woman on the board, and a person who valued loyalty above all else, looked up from her folder. Her eyes were like chips of blue ice as she fixed them on Julian. "Julian, is this documentation accurate?" she asked. Her voice was low and dangerous, the kind of voice that precedes a total collapse. Julian tried to speak, but he just made a small, choking sound in the back of his throat. He looked at me with a mixture of pure hatred and a deep, hollow shock. He truly could not believe that I had done it. He could not believe that the quiet woman who had made his tea every morning for 3 decades had the spine to stand in his boardroom and strip him of his dignity. I stood up and smoothed the front of my silk suit jacket. As the managing member of the Vance Heritage Trust, which currently holds the majority of the voting shares that Julian signed over to the trust yesterday morning, I am calling for an immediate and emergency vote to suspend Julian Vance's executive powers, effective this very second, I said. I am also requesting that his access to all company systems, digital files, and physical buildings be revoked until a full forensic audit can be completed by an outside firm. I have already arranged for a team of independent investigators to be waiting in the lobby to take over the servers and the filing cabinets. The vote did not even take 5 minutes. They did not even ask Julian to leave the room while they discussed it. They just did it right there in front of him, as if he were already a ghost. One by one, they raised their hands in the air. Even the men Julian thought were his closest allies and his best friends did not hesitate for a heartbeat. They were business people, first and foremost, and Julian had suddenly become a very bad investment that threatened their own reputations. When the final hand went up, Julian collapsed back into his leather chair. He looked like all the air had been let out of his body. The head of company security walked into the room a moment later. He was a man who had worked for Julian for 10 years, but he did not look at him with respect anymore. He looked at him like a problem that needed to be cleared away before the next meeting. "Mr. Vance, I'm going to need your security badge and your company-issued phone right now," the man said, his voice flat and professional. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city, and watched in the reflection as Julian slowly unclipped the plastic badge from his belt. He handed it over with a hand that would not stop trembling. He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of a dark, burning question that he did not have the courage to ask out loud. I did not give him the satisfaction of an answer. I just watched as they led him out of the room he had ruled like a king for decades. But as the heavy oak doors closed behind his slumped shoulders, I knew this was only the first part of the fall. He still had the key to a secret account I had not mentioned to the board yet, and I was about to find out exactly how far he would go to try and save what little he had left. The first 24 hours were a blur of digital deaths. Julian was a man who lived through his devices, convinced that his importance was mirrored in the glowing screens of his phone and laptop. When I sat in the kitchen the next morning drinking my tea in the soft light of the breakfast nook, I knew the exact moment his world started to blink out. At 9 in the morning, his corporate email was deactivated. He would have been sitting in some expensive coffee shop in the city, trying to check his messages and bark orders at his subordinates, only to see the red error box flashing on his screen. Then his cloud storage was wiped. Every photo, every document, and every secret he thought was safe in the air was gone. I had the IT team at Vance Global move everything to a secure server under my name. He was being erased from the history of the company he thought he owned, one password at a time. By noon, the financial collapse began in earnest. Julian was a man who never carried cash. He liked the weight of a black credit card in his hand. He liked the way people looked at him when he pulled it out of his expensive leather wallet. I got the first notification on my phone at 12:30. He was at a high-end Italian restaurant, probably trying to treat himself to a luxury lunch to soothe his ego. The charge for $300 was declined. 5 minutes later, he tried his personal backup card. Declined. 10 minutes after that, he tried the card he had given Chloe for her personal expenses. Declined. I could almost see him sitting there at the white-clothed table, his face turning that specific shade of deep purple, trying to explain to a young waiter that there must be a mistake with the bank. But there was no mistake. The trust was the owner of those accounts now, and I had closed the tap. The afternoon brought the social collapse. In a town like Greenwich, news travels faster than a summer storm. By 3 o'clock, the wives at the country club were already whispering over their salads. I received several texts from women I had known for years, women who had always been a little too friendly with Julian at parties. They weren't checking on me. They were looking for gossip. They told me they had seen Chloe walking out of her apartment building with 2 large suitcases, looking like she was in a very big hurry. It turns out that when the rent check for the penthouse bounced and the silver car was picked up by a towing company, Chloe's love for Julian vanished as quickly as his bank balance. She didn't want a man, she wanted a lifestyle, and Julian was now just a man in a cheap suit with no place to go, and no way to pay for her company. When evening fell, I was back at the estate. I had spent the day with a team of locksmiths. Every door in the house now had a new soul, a new mechanism that Julian did not have the key for. I had also spoken to the security team. They were standing at the end of the long driveway, 2 large men in dark suits who didn't care about Julian's name or his history. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the front gate on the security monitor. At 7 o'clock, Julian's car appeared. It was the company car, a heavy black sedan that he treated like a throne. He sat at the gate for a long time, pressing the button on his sun visor. He must have thought the battery was dead. He got out and walked to the intercom, his movements jerky and desperate. "Eleanor, open the gate." His voice came through the speaker, distorted and tinny. I didn't answer. I just watched. He started to kick the iron bars, his expensive shoes making a dull clanking sound that echoed through the quiet street. He looked like a trapped animal. He eventually gave up and climbed over the stone wall, falling into the dirt and mulch on the other side, ruining his suit. He ran up the driveway, his chest heaving. When he got to the front door, he reached into his pocket for his keys. I heard him fumbling with the lock in the dark. He tried every key on his ring over and over again, but none of them would even fit into the new keyhole. He started pounding on the heavy wood, screaming my name until his voice went hoarse. I just sat in the dark a few feet away, feeling nothing but a deep and heavy sense of calm. The second day was even worse for him. He had spent the night in the car, parked on the street just outside our neighborhood gates. At 10 in the morning, the repo team I had authorized from the company arrived. I watched from my bedroom window as they hooked the black sedan to the back of a large truck. Julian was standing on the sidewalk, disheveled and wild-eyed, arguing with the driver. But the driver just pointed to the paperwork. The car belonged to Vance Global, and Vance Global wanted its property back. Julian was left standing on the curb, holding nothing but his leather briefcase and a look of pure shock. He looked like a stranger in the very neighborhood he used to rule. He tried to go to the bank in person later that afternoon. I heard about this from Arthur, who was keeping a close eye on everything. Julian had walked into the main branch on 5th Avenue, demanding to speak to the manager. He wanted to withdraw $100,000 in cash, thinking he could still bully his way through the system. The manager, a man who had played golf with Julian for years, had to tell him the truth in front of the other customers. The accounts were no longer in his name. The money was gone, moved into the Heritage Trust for our children. Julian had shouted, he had made a scene, and eventually the bank security had to ask him to leave the building. He was becoming a ghost in the city he thought he had conquered. By the end of the 48 hours, the collapse was total. He was no longer a CEO, a husband, or a homeowner. He was just a man with a phone that was about to run out of battery and no one left to call. I had moved all his personal belongings, the ones that truly belonged to him and not the trust, into 3 cardboard boxes and left them at the very edge of the property, near the mailboxes. I didn't want him stepping foot on the grass again. I watched him find them late that night under the glow of the street lamp. He didn't even have the strength to be angry anymore. He just sat on the ground next to the boxes, his head in his hands, looking like a discarded toy. I went upstairs and prepared for bed. I had spent the day looking over new garden designs. I wanted to tear out the roses Julian liked and plant something fresh and vibrant, something that was mine. I was brushing my hair when my phone started to vibrate on the marble vanity. I looked down and saw his name. Julian, the man who had spent 30 years making me feel small and invisible, was calling me. I watched the phone move across the marble surface, the light from the screen reflecting in the mirror. I didn't feel the urge to pick it up. I didn't want to hear his excuses, his apologies, or his threats. I waited until the ringing stopped, and the room was quiet again. A small notification popped up on the screen. New voicemail. I didn't touch it. I simply set the phone to silent, turned off the bedside lamp, and closed my eyes. The silence was the best gift I had ever given myself, and I intended to enjoy every second of it. The rain began as a soft mist and turned into a heavy, rhythmic drumming against the windows of the Greenwich estate. I sat in the library, the room where Julian used to hold court, surrounded by the smell of old leather and the faint, lingering scent of his expensive cigars. I was wearing my favorite cream-colored cashmere sweater and holding a cup of herbal tea. The house was warm, the fireplace crackling softly, but outside, the world was turning dark and cold. I looked at the security monitor on the desk. A figure was standing at the front door, hunched over against the wind, looking small and defeated under the glow of the porch light. It was Julian. I did not move toward the door immediately. I watched him through the screen for a few minutes. He looked like a stranger. His expensive suit was soaked through, clinging to his shoulders in a way that made him look thin and fragile. His hair, usually perfectly styled, was plastered to his forehead. He reached out and pressed the doorbell, a long, desperate ring that echoed through the silent hallway. I set my tea down on the coaster and walked slowly toward the foyer. I did not turn on the hall lights. I preferred to stay in the shadows, where I could see him, but he could only guess where I was. He knocked on the heavy oak door, 3 sharp, frantic raps. "Eleanor," he called out. His voice was thin, stripped of the booming authority that used to make his employees tremble. "Eleanor, please. I know you are in there. I can see the light from the library. Please, just open the door for a minute. It is freezing out here, and I have nowhere else to go." I stood just inches away from the wood. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing. I felt a strange sense of peace. For 30 years, I had been the one waiting for him to come home, the one wondering where he was and who he was with. Now, the roles were reversed. He was the one begging for entry, and I was the one holding the keys. I did not open the door. I did not even unlock the deadbolt. I simply spoke, my voice calm and steady, as if we were discussing the weather over breakfast. "Hello, Julian," I said. I heard him gasp on the other side. He leaned his forehead against the door. I could see the shadow of his head through the frosted glass panels. "Eleanor, thank God," he whispered. "Please, let me in. Everything is a mess. I went to the apartment and Chloe. She is gone. She took everything that was not bolted down. She even took the silver and the small safe from the closet. She told me she was not going to stick around for a man who could not even buy a round of drinks. She laughed at me, Eleanor. She laughed in my face and told me I was an old fool." I tilted my head, listening to the rain. "That sounds very difficult, Julian," I said. "I imagine it must be quite a shock to realize that she only loved the reflection of your bank account. I tried to warn you that some people are only attracted to the light, not the person holding the candle. But you were so sure that you had found something special." He let out a dry, hacking sob. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. I see that now. I have been wandering the city for hours. I tried to go to the club, but they told me my membership had been suspended. I tried to call a car, but the app told me my account was closed. I had to walk 3 miles in the rain just to get here. Please, Eleanor, Just let me come in and dry off. We can talk about this. We can fix the trust. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just do not leave me out here like this. I walked over to the small side window and looked out at the driveway. I saw the 3 cardboard boxes I had left by the gate. They were soaked now, the cardboard turning to mush in the puddles. Your things are by the mailbox, Julian, I told him. I made sure to pack your favorite watch and the shoes you like so much. I did not want you to be without the essentials. He pounded his fist against the door, but it was a weak gesture, more of a plea than a demand. I do not care about the shoes. I care about my life. This is my house, Eleanor. I paid for every brick and every shingle. You cannot just lock me out of my own home. Actually, I can, I replied, my voice remaining soft and kind. This house belongs to the Heritage Trust now. It is for the children. Since I am the trustee, I have a responsibility to keep the property secure. Having a man with your current legal and financial complications on the premises would be a liability. I am sure you understand. You always told me that business comes before personal feelings. I am just following your lead. There was a long silence. I could hear the rain dripping off the eaves. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the door frame. Julian spoke again, and this time his voice was so low I had to lean in to hear him. What am I supposed to do? I have no money. I have no car. I have no one. I have spent 30 years building an empire, and I am standing in the mud with nothing to show for it. Are you really going to let me sleep in the street? I thought about the night he stayed out until 4 in the morning while I sat by the phone, terrified he had been in an accident. I thought about the photos of him and Chloe on the yacht, drinking champagne while our daughter was crying because her father had missed her graduation. I thought about the $4 million he stole from our son's future to buy a necklace for a girl who did not even know his middle name. I think you will find a way, Julian, I said. You are a very resourceful man. You always told me that a true shark never stops swimming. Maybe you can find a shelter or a cheap motel. I believe there is one about 5 miles down the road. It might be a long walk, but the exercise will give you time to think about your next moves. Eleanor, please, he begged. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. I will apologize to the kids. I will make it up to you. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Just open the door. I leaned back against the wall, looking at the beautiful crown, molding I had picked out 20 years ago. I felt no anger. I felt no hate. I just felt finished. I am sorry too, Julian, I said. I am sorry it took me 30 years to realize that I was the one holding this whole family together, while you were just taking the credit. But the doors are closed now. They are closed in Greenwich, they are closed at the office, and they are closed in my heart. Good night, Julian. I turned away from the door and started to walk back toward the library. I could hear him screaming my name, his voice cracking with desperation. He started kicking the door again, but I knew those heavy oak panels would not budge. He could scream until the sun came up, but no one was coming to help him. The neighbors were too far away, and the security guards at the gate had strict orders not to let anyone through without my permission. I sat back down in my chair and picked up my tea. It was still warm. I pulled a new folder out of my briefcase. It was the final set of documents from the Sapphire Fund. Julian thought he had hidden that money well, but he did not realize that I had found the last trapdoor. Tomorrow morning, the bank in the Caymans would receive a very interesting letter from my legal team, and the very last of his hidden cash would be frozen. He thought he was at the bottom of the pit tonight, but he did not realize that the floor was about to drop one more time. I took a sip of my tea and listened to the rain, waiting for the sound of his footsteps to finally fade away down the driveway. He was gone, but the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow, I would meet with the board to finalize his permanent removal from the company, and then the true vengeance would begin. I had saved the most devastating move for the very end, and Julian would never see it coming until the handcuffs clicked shut. I woke up this morning before the alarm went off. For 30 years, I woke up to the sound of Julian grumbling about his early meetings or complaining that the sunlight hitting the bed was too bright. I used to jump out of bed immediately, rushing to close the heavy velvet curtains and heading straight to the kitchen to make sure his coffee was exactly the right temperature. My mornings were never mine. They were a series of tasks designed to keep a powerful man from losing his temper. But today, there was only the sound of a soft breeze blowing through the open window and the distant, happy chirping of birds in the garden. I stayed under the covers for an extra 20 minutes, just because I could. I watched the shadows of the tree branches dance on the ceiling and realized that the heavy tightness in my chest was completely gone. That weight I used to carry every single day, the feeling that I was walking on a frozen lake waiting for the ice to crack, had vanished. It had been exactly 1 year since that rainy night at the front door, and my life was finally my own. I went downstairs to the kitchen of my new home. It is much smaller than the Greenwich estate, but every square inch of it belongs to me. It has large windows that let in the morning light, and a small breakfast nook that overlooks a garden full of wildflowers. I made a pot of coffee, and I didn't have to worry about whether it was too strong for someone else, or if the kitchen was perfectly tidy before a business associate arrived for a surprise meeting. I sat at my small wooden table and watched the steam rise from my mug. I thought about my children. Sarah had called me last night, her voice full of excitement as she talked about her new job. Michael was finally moving into his own place, using the money I had safely tucked away in the trust. They were happy. They were safe. And most importantly, they looked at me with a kind of respect I had never seen before. I was no longer just the quiet mother in the background. I was the woman who had saved their future. After I finished my coffee, I got dressed for work. I didn't have to choose an outfit that matched Julian's tie or something that would make him look good at a corporate lunch. I put on a simple, well-tailored suit in a soft shade of blue that I actually liked. I did my hair and looked in the mirror. I saw a woman who looked younger than she did 5 years ago. The lines of worry around my eyes had softened, and my smile felt real for the first time in decades. I drove myself to the city, enjoying the feeling of the steering wheel in my hands and the music playing on the radio. I liked knowing exactly where I was going and why I was going there. When I pulled up to the beautiful brick building on a quiet street near the park, I felt a swell of pride that was better than any piece of jewelry Julian had ever bought me to apologize for a late night. I walked up to the front door and looked at the gold letters on the glass. Eleanor Vance, Financial Consulting for Women. I had spent my entire life being the silent brain behind a man who didn't appreciate me. And now, I was using those same skills to help women who were in the exact position I used to be in. I was no longer building an empire for someone else. I was building a safety net for people who needed it most. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The office was bright and filled with plants. It felt like a place where people could breathe again. My first appointment of the day was at 10 o'clock. It was a woman named Margaret. She reminded me so much of the person I used to be. She sat in the chair across from my desk, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at me with so much fear in her eyes, wondering if she was making a mistake, wondering if she could ever survive without her husband's permission. She had a folder full of papers that she didn't quite understand, and she was terrified that she was going to lose everything. I reached across the desk and placed my hand on hers. I told her to take a deep breath. I told her that she wasn't alone, and that she wasn't crazy for wanting to be free. I told her that we were going to go through every single number together, and by the time we were finished, she would have a map to her own life. Helping these women was the best kind of karma. Every time I helped a wife find a hidden account or protect her inheritance from a greedy partner, I felt like I was winning my own battle all over again. Julian had become a distant memory. a story people told as a warning about what happens when you underestimate the person standing right next to you. I heard through the grapevine that he was living in a small, cramped apartment in another state, trying to find a job in a world that had moved on without him. He had no power, no influence, and no one to make his coffee in the morning. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't have enough energy to waste on hate. I was too busy living a life that was full of purpose and peace. I spent the rest of the morning working on a complicated case involving a secret offshore fund, the kind of puzzle I used to solve for Julian every day. I felt sharp and focused. My mind, the one Julian used to call flighty and emotional, was now my greatest tool. I worked through the lunch hour because I was actually enjoying myself. I didn't have to rush home to manage a household staff or prepare for a dinner party I didn't want to host. I could eat a sandwich at my desk and focus on the work that truly mattered. By 5 o'clock, I was ready to head home. I turned off the lights in my office and walked back to my car. The city was glowing with the light of the setting sun, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged in it. I wasn't a shadow or a ghost anymore. I was a person with a name and a voice. I drove back to my house, thinking about what I wanted to do for dinner. Maybe I would just have a salad and read a book in the garden. Maybe I would call a friend and go out for a glass of wine. The choice was mine. And that was the most beautiful thing of all. As I walked up my driveway and looked at the house I had built for myself, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had lost a $15 million mansion that was filled with lies and a husband who treated me like a servant, but I had kept the only things that were worth having. I kept my children's love, I kept my sharp mind, and I kept my dignity. I walked through my front door and locked it behind me, knowing that the only people who would ever have a key were the people who truly loved me. I had lost the life I thought I wanted, and I was so glad to lose the man who never deserved the woman I became.